Okay, so this is Mrs. Cavalier, and today we're going to be talking about the author study. This isn't all of the authors that you have to choose from, but I would say it's probably the fan favorites. So, I break them up into short story writers and poets. So I'll give you a little bit of information. Now, some of these authors have been chosen for various reasons. Some of them have been chosen because of their writing style. And some of them have been chosen because of the time period with which they wrote in. It may have had a big impact on their writing. And then other reasons, they may have had a really interesting family life or personal life that had a big impact on their writing. So for various reasons, these authors have been chosen. And they really do run a span of time period from the beginning of American literature in the 1700s all the way through to authors that are writing today. And so let's begin. So we're going to start with the poets. And the first one we're starting with is E. E. Cummings. Now, a lot of people pick E. E. Cummings because of the style with which he wrote his poetry. As you can see, I wasn't being lazy. E. E. Cummings does not capitalize his name, and he really doesn't capitalize anything even in his work. When you look at his work, it looks very simple. It looks a little unorganized, but there's a deeper meaning to what he's writing. So if you feel like you like a little bit of a non-conventional writing style, then E. E. Cummings might be your poet. I know that a lot of his writing stemmed from the aftermath of World War I and World War II, so he might be of interest if you're interested in that time period. Our next poet here is Sylvia Plath. She wrote a lot during the 50s and the 60s. A little bit of a backstory about Sylvia Plath. She was married to Ted Hughes, who at the time was the poet laureate. And what a poet laureate is literally, I mean, pretty much just the poet of the year. So that person was like the famous poet that year. And so Ted Hughes was a famous poet. He was not the best husband at times. And Sylvia Plath, who was a writer in her own right, was never gained that notoriety that she wanted. She did after she passed away in a horrible, horrible way. So if you're interested in finding out about that, you will. But something also to note, the most famous work by her is actually a novel called The Bell Jar. And it's considered almost a memoir because it chronicles the time of a girl who everyone now knows was Sylvia Plath, who spent some of her teenage years in a mental institution for being depressed. So back in the 50s, we deal with depression today and mental illness in a whole different way than it was seen back in the 50s. So if a girl, especially a teenage girl, was showing signs of depression, or they were put in a mental institution instead of like outpatient and working through it. And so it does chronicle her time there. And she did battle with depression for her life. So her work is considered feminist writing. And it does tend to be a bit weighty. And some may consider it a bit, depressing. But again, she was a major, major feminist writer. And so that's why she's on this list. And so that is Sylvia Plath. Now, this is Langston Hughes. You may know him. You may have read some of his poetry and short stories earlier, maybe in middle school. He wrote a short story called Thank You, Ma'am, which you may know. Now, he was a huge pioneer of the Harlem Renaissance, which took place during the 1920s. And up in Harlem, there was this huge, bringing back of music and art and literature and dancing. And, it was all happening up with the African Americans up in Harlem. And so he was one of the major writers of that time period. And so if you like that time period and you want to read what it was like perhaps to be an African American during this huge, important time in history, you would want to maybe look into Langston Hughes. And again, Thank You, Ma'am, you may have read. It was a short story. He wrote everything. It was about the boy who mugs the old lady. And instead of the old lady turning him into the police, she literally like whacks him over the head. He thought she was a frail little old lady, but not so much. And she literally like whacks him over the head and then, says, get in here. feeds him dinner and chats with him. And so he learns a little bit about, you know, a little humility and a little lesson. So that's Langston Hughes. You might have read Theme for English B, which is a poem that he wrote. I Too Sing America. It's one of his famous poems. So Robert Frost is another major poet and fan favorite that a lot of people like to research. He lived a long time. Like, he lived to be a ripe old age. And one of the last things he ever wrote was John F. Kennedy's inaugural address in the 60s. But he wrote throughout the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. And you may be familiar with his poetry if you read The Outsiders. Do you remember Nothing Gold Can Stay? And Stay Gold, Pony Boy? Well, that is a poem by Robert Frost. And some of his other popular ones are Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening, The Road Less Taken. He often wrote about nature, and he wrote about like a person's inner struggles with themselves. And he tends to be a popular one to research. That's Robert Frost. So Emily Dickinson is another fan favorite. She's interesting. She lived during I want to say the early 1800s. I'm not 100% sure on that. I think it's 1800s. And she was not famous during her life because she very, very rarely left the house. She was what we would now consider a recluse. And so all of her poetry was just written, for the sheer sake of enjoying writing and poetry. And so they found all of her poetry after she passed away. They found all of this poetry written up in the attic. And that's why all of her poetry doesn't have any titles, because she didn't mean for it to be seen by anybody. And she had a very specific rhyming pattern, a very specific way that she wrote. And a lot of people mistakenly think that Emily Dickinson's poetry, because she didn't leave the house, is going to be very depressing. But actually, some of her poetry it's very insightful. I would say her poetry is very internal, very insightful. Sometimes it's uplifting, sometimes it's a little morose. So I think she has a little bit for everyone, I would say. And so that's Emily Dickinson. So Edna St. Vincent Millay wrote she would be considered a contemporary of Sylvia Plath. And so she was also part of the feminist writer movement. But where Sylvia Plath's writing was a little more depressing, I guess you could say, Edna St. Vincent Millay's writing was a little bit more uplifting, a little bit more positive spin. She's an interesting lady also. She has an interesting past, some issues she had to work through, but her poetry, even though it's feminist poetry, is certainly different than Sylvia Plath's. She is known for her sonnets. So if you're familiar with Shakespeare's sonnets, if you read one last year, she wrote in that same sonnet style. And so again, she was more like 50s, 60s, and maybe the 70s as well. So this is Maya Angelou. She only passed away a few years ago. She lived to be, she's like 96, 97 years old. She has a huge writing career, very prolific, which means she was very talented in many different genres. So she wrote novels and poetry, and she wrote short stories and essays and memoirs. And she wrote a lot about, depending on what time period she was writing about, she wrote a lot about what it was like to be a child in the 1930s, being African American at that time. And then at other times throughout history, she continued writing up until her death. She literally had something published the year she passed away. So, she really was, she really did continue writing. And so that's Maya Angelou. If Maya Angelou is picked already, another author that would be considered in that same vein would be Alice Walker. And she's more of a short story writer, but you might enjoy her writing as well. She wrote a story called Everyday Use, among many others. So this is Maya Angelou. If Maya Angelou is chosen, you could always choose Alice Walker or look into Alice Walker. So here's our local guy, Walt Whitman. He's considered pretty much like one of the fathers of American poetry, probably one of our most popular ones. It seems you have read Oh Captain, My Captain, perhaps, at some point in your English career. Oh, Captain, My Captain was written in response to the death of Abraham Lincoln. So if you're interested in the Civil War time period, before and after and during the Civil War, this might be your poet. He also wrote a poem called I Hear America Singing, which is very patriotic. He instilled nationalism in people. It means like pride of country. And again, he's also a local. I think he was born in Huntington. And I think his birthplace, like you could go and visit his home. And you have a mall named after him. So I bet he's proud of that. So this is Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And often people like the way her picture came out. I swear it's the best picture I could find of her. But she's actually a British author. And she is best known for her love poems. If you've ever been to a wedding and heard the poem that starts, how do I love thee? Let me count the ways. That is probably, one of the most famous poems, and it is her poem. So if there are romantics out there, perhaps you would choose Elizabeth Barrett Browning. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the short story authors. And again, they also span the time periods, I would say. Okay, so this is O. Henry, and he wrote during the turn of the last century. So 1900s, 1910s was when a lot of his writing was. And so something interesting to note that O. Henry is not his name, his real name. It is a pen name. He had written under this pseudonym while he was in jail. So if you want to know why he's in jail, I guess you'll have to look into that. But you may have read the story, The Gift of the Magi, which is the story about the husband and wife who love each other very, very much, and they want to buy each other something nice for Christmas. And they both sacrifice something that they have to buy their spouse a nice present. And so if you are familiar with that story, O. Henry often wrote, like his literary device would be irony, because the other story that he wrote, The Ransom of Red Chief, also has a twist, an ironic twist in it. So he often wrote about morals, the goodness in people, and then again, sometimes like The Ransom of Red Chief has a bit of humor in it, and the twist is funny. So that's O. Henry. So going a little further back in history, we have Washington Irving. Now, Washington Irving probably is not for everyone. His writing is heightened because he wrote at the beginning of like our American, like he's one of the first American writers. Like Nathaniel Hawthorne, they got together, they were drinking brewskis at the bar. No, I'm just kidding. But they realized that, we're not British subjects anymore, so maybe we need to create an American literary cultural identity. And so he was one of the first. You may have read The Legend of Sleepy Hollow with the Headless Horseman. That is Washington Irving. He also wrote the story about Rip Van Winkle, which is a story about a man who, he's tired of listening to his wife nag, and so he goes and takes a walk in the woods. He falls asleep under a tree, and he wakes up 75 years later. And so when he went to sleep in the woods, he was a loyal British subject, and when he wakes up 75 years later, it's a new America. And so it kind of goes through some of the changes in our country. And it's humorous in the way he wakes up and he's got the big long beard because he's been sleeping for 75 years. And as someone pointed out, it sort of sounds like the beginning of a time travel novel. So perhaps if you like that kind of thing. But again, his writing is not for everyone. So maybe Washington Irving you'd want to check first before necessarily picking him. Certainly a lot of research on him, though. And then at a completely other end of the spectrum, we have Gary Soto. Now, Gary Soto writes today. He's considered a young adult author. He's written, again, he's another guy who's written so much. He's written novels, he's written short stories, poems. I would say probably his short stories would probably be your best bet. And he is considered a Latino American. He grew up in California. He writes a lot about what it's like to be a teenager, especially a teenage boy growing up in the barrios of California. And so that's sort of the cultural the culture you'd want to look into. Uh, his writing is easy to get through. The research is not as easy. So you'll need help with the research if you pick Gary Soto. We'll gladly help you with that, though. Okay, so this is Jack London. So he writes a lot of like natural, like survivalist stories. Like he wrote a book called The Call of the Wild, which is about the sled team. He wrote White Fang, which again was about a dog, like a sled dog. And he wrote some short stories. One of them is To Build a Fire, things like that. So if you maybe liked Gary Paulson back in the day, he wrote those survivalists like Brian's Winter, what's the first one called? Anyone remember the Brian stories? About the survival, the plane crashed and then the boy had to live in the woods. I can't think of what it's called. Hatchet. Sorry about that. If you like that kind of story when you were younger, maybe a more classical author like Jack London you might be interested in reading. And this is Ray Bradbury. So if you like science fiction, Ray Bradbury might be someone that you'd be interested in researching. He's pretty much like the grandfather of science fiction writing. You may have heard of him before. He has tons of work out there, huge body of work. He wrote Fahrenheit 451. He wrote, God, so many. There Will Be Soft Rains. He wrote The Belt. And again, he was writing during the time period where, a lot of things were happening in science. And so it was a little worrisome to people because they said, well, what if this really happened? Like, what if these things really did come to play? And so that's Ray Bradbury. Now, if Ray Bradbury is taken, you can always choose Isaac Asimov, who wrote I, Robot, and he wrote a bunch of stories called the Robot Stories, and he's in that similar vein. A little harder to find the stories, but we'll certainly find them for you. So this is Ray Bradbury. Another author to consider is Isaac Asimov. Okay, so this is John Updike. He also recently passed away, and with his passing was like a great loss for the literary community because not only was he a writer and a poet and an essayist and a memoirist and a novelist, but he was also a major, major editor. Everyone wanted to work with this guy. He was really very, very talented in his field. What he is best known for, he wrote a bunch of novels called the Rabbit novels, like Rabbit Run. He wrote them in the 70s, I would say. But he also wrote some pretty well-known short stories. And again, I would say that he's probably best known for his short story A and P. And it's, the protagonist, the narrator is a teenage boy working at the A&P. And it's sort of time. I mean, some of it is a little out, you'd feel it was dated, but the feelings are there still. He also wrote a few other ones in that vein. Sports short stories. He tended to like sports. He wrote a story called like The Tao of Yankee Stadium, things like that. So that's John Updike. Okay, so Kurt Vonnegut it kind of is considered science fiction, but he's also considered satire. And what satire is when a writer is poking fun at like a political climate or or society as a whole. And so there are two stories that you'd want to choose from Kurt Vonnegut because a lot of his writing might be over your heads at this time in your life. So the two stories that you may want to read, you may have read Harrison Bergeron, which is the story about, it's like a society where everybody has to be exactly the same. Like no one can be more talented or no one can be better looking. And like, let's say you were good looking, you'd have to wear a mask. Or let's say you were a really good dancer, you'd have to wear weights on your legs. Does this sound familiar? Yeah. Okay, so I feel like I'm doing a TED Talk because there is an audience live right now, Miss Rice's class. Right, he wrote that, like what it would be like. This one man, Harrison Bergeron, had everything going for him, so he was literally covered from head to toe. That's one of his short stories. And another one is Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, which is where science has finally figured out the cure for death. And so nobody is going to die anymore, and which sounds great because nobody really wants to die. But it goes into what would really happen if we all could live forever. Population for one thing. Where would we all stay? But that's Kurt Vonnegut. This is Shirley Jackson, and she would be almost considered like a horror. Like if you like macabre, like if you're enjoying reading like Edgar Allan Poe, she's a more modern writer. She wrote, the last century at least, but she wrote a story called The Lottery, and she wrote a story called Charlie. And so if you like that kind of creepy, horror-ish type of writing, then Shirley Jackson might be someone that you're interested in. And another writer that you might be interested in that's not on here is W. W. Jacobs, who wrote The Monkey's Paw, among other works. So that's another kind of creepy-ish writer. And all right, that is all she wrote. So have a good day.